Good morning, guys. Welcome to Mug Briefing. The U.S. just helped broker a rare moment of cooperation in the Ukraine war, and it happened far from the battlefield. In talks this week in Abu Dhabi, American, Ukrainian, and Russian officials reached a deal that produced a major prisoner exchange and reopened military communication channels. Over 2 days of meetings ending February 5th, the delegations agreed to swap 314 prisoners, the first large exchange in about 5 months. The deal was announced by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, and transfers happened the same day near Ukraine's border. At the same time, the U.S. European Command said Washington and Moscow agreed to restore high-level military-to-military dialogue, meaning their armed forces will again have a formal line to talk directly in order to avoid dangerous misunderstandings. This happened because all sides wanted a limited, practical result they could achieve without settling the war itself. Prisoner swaps are one of the few areas where Ukraine and Russia have continued negotiating, even while fighting goes on. The talks did not produce a ceasefire and attacks continued, but they did show that narrow agreements are still possible. What this means is modest but important. Returning prisoners reduces immediate human suffering, and reopening military communication lowers the risk of accidental escalation between nuclear-armed powers. It does not end the conflict, but it creates a small layer of stability in a volatile situation. For Americans, the key impact is risk reduction. Better communication between U.S. and Russian forces lowers the chance of a military incident that could pull NATO into a wider crisis, which directly affects U.S. security and global markets tied to the war. Negotiators say more exchanges and follow-up talks are likely in the coming weeks, suggesting a slow pattern of incremental deals rather than a sudden peace breakthrough. The war continues, but this agreement shows that even limited diplomacy can still function inside an ongoing conflict. Moving on to the next story, this one is about the U.S. economy and new labor data. New U.S. labor data is sending a mixed signal about how strong the job market really is. And that matters because hiring trends shape wages, interest rates, and everyday costs. The latest numbers suggest employers may be slowing down a bit, but not slamming the brakes. On February 5th, the government reported that job openings, open positions companies are trying to fill, fell sharply in December to 6.542 million, down 386,000 and the lowest level since 2020. The same morning, a separate report showed new unemployment claims rose to 231,000 for the last week of January, an increase of 22,000. Claims are still low by historical standards, but the jump caught attention. This likely happened because businesses are becoming more cautious about adding staff after a long stretch of aggressive hiring. Economists say winter storms and seasonal quirks may have temporarily pushed claims higher, and much of the drop in openings was concentrated in professional services and retail rather than across the whole economy. What this means is the labor market may be cooling from hot to more stable. That can ease pressure on inflation, but it can also slow wage growth. For Americans, the big impact is money. Weaker hiring can make job searches tougher in some sectors, while also influencing Federal Reserve decisions that affect mortgage rates and credit card interest. The next key test will be the January jobs report next week, which will show whether this slowdown is real or just a one-month wobble. For now, the picture is not a collapse, but a labor market that may be losing a little momentum after years of strength. Moving on to the next story, this one is about government pressure and the Federal Reserve. A tense moment in Washington is raising questions about how independent the Federal Reserve really is. And that matters because the Fed controls interest rates that affect nearly every American loan. The issue surfaced during a Senate hearing on February 5th. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked whether the administration would promise not to sue or investigate President Trump's nominee to lead the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, if he refused to cut interest rates the way the president wanted. Senator Elizabeth Warren pressed for a clear guarantee. Bessent declined and answered that the decision would be up to the president. The question came after Trump had joked publicly about suing his nominee if rates were not lowered. This happened because lawmakers from both parties are worried about political pressure on the central bank. The Federal Reserve is designed to make rate decisions without direct White House control, so markets trust that policy is based on economics, not politics. What this means is uncertainty. Even talk of legal pressure can shake confidence in that independence. Supporters of a strong firewall around the Fed argue that credibility is crucial to stable markets, while critics say elected leaders should have more influence over economic direction. For Americans, the impact is financial. If investors think Fed decisions are politicized, markets can swing and borrowing costs like mortgages and credit cards can move unpredictably. Expect more congressional scrutiny and debate as Warsh's confirmation process continues. The episode does not change interest rates today, but it intensifies the fight over who ultimately shapes U.S. monetary policy. Let's move to another story, this time involving technology stocks and the AI market pullback. Wall Street is pulling back from the AI boom, and the drop is big enough to rattle the broader market. Investors are suddenly questioning how much money tech companies are spending to chase artificial intelligence and how fast that spending will actually pay off. Over February 4th and into February 5th, software and AI-linked stocks sold off sharply after a high-profile AI product launch and new signals that major tech companies like Amazon and Alphabet plan extremely heavy AI investment. Reporting tracked roughly $1 trillion in market value wiped out across software and data services companies in a short span. The slide spread to giants like Microsoft and Nvidia and dragged the Nasdaq lower as traders rotated money out of fast-growing tech and into safer, slower-moving stocks. This happened because investors are rethinking the math. AI promises huge future profits, but it also requires massive upfront spending on chips, data centers, and research. The concern is that margins, how much companies keep after costs, could shrink before revenues catch up. What this means is a reset in expectations. Markets are shifting from excitement about growth to scrutiny about profitability. That does not mean AI is failing, but it does mean investors want clearer proof that spending will translate into earnings. For Americans, the impact is mostly financial. Retirement accounts and index funds are heavily exposed to big tech, so sharp swings can hit household wealth and confidence. In the short term, expect continued volatility as companies report earnings and clarify their AI strategies. The market is deciding how much today's spending is worth tomorrow's payoff, and that debate is far from settled. Moving on to the next story, this one is about global security and upcoming U.S.-Iran talks. The U.S. and Iran are preparing for direct talks at a moment of high tension in the Middle East, and the stakes are about preventing a wider conflict. The two countries have agreed to meet in Muscat, Oman, but they're already arguing about what the talks should cover. Over the last 2 days, both governments confirmed the meeting, and Iran sent its foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, to lead its delegation. Washington says the discussion should include Iran's nuclear program, plus missiles and regional military activity. Tehran insists the talks. Moving on to the next story, this one is about global security and upcoming U.S.-Iran talks. The U.S. and Iran are preparing for direct talks at a moment of high tension in the Middle East, and the stakes are about preventing a wider conflict. The two countries have agreed to meet in Muscat, Oman, but they're already arguing about what the talks should cover. Over the last 2 days, both governments confirmed the meeting, and Iran sent its foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, to lead its delegation. Washington says the discussion should include Iran's nuclear program, plus missiles and regional military activity. Tehran insists the talks must stay focused only on nuclear issues. That disagreement sets the tone before negotiators even sit down. This is happening because both sides want to avoid escalation while still protecting their core demands. The region has seen a U.S. military buildup and rising tensions, so diplomacy offers a pressure valve even if trust is low. What this means is the talks may be narrow and fragile. They could produce small technical steps on nuclear oversight, but the public dispute over the agenda makes a sweeping deal unlikely right away. For Americans, the impact is security and energy. A successful channel lowers the risk of a conflict that could involve U.S. forces, while failure could rattle global oil markets and raise fuel prices at home. Negotiators are expected to proceed with a limited nuclear focus first, with Gulf countries quietly trying to keep the conversation alive. The meeting does not resolve the standoff, but it keeps diplomacy in motion at a dangerous moment. The next story is about government funding and a congressional fight over immigration enforcement. A funding fight in Congress is turning into a debate about how federal immigration officers operate, and it could affect whether the Department of Homeland Security stays fully funded this month. Democratic leaders are tying new money for DHS to a set of enforcement reforms. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries sent Republicans a formal list of 10 changes they want written into law. The proposals target immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border protection. They include banning masks during operations, requiring visible identification and body cameras, limiting paramilitary gear, and tightening rules on when agents can enter private property. Democrats say they may withhold votes for a DHS funding bill unless reforms are included. Republican leaders quickly called the demands unrealistic and signaled resistance. This push follows public anger over recent enforcement incidents, including fatal shootings in Minneapolis that intensified scrutiny of federal tactics. Democrats argue the reforms are about accountability and safety. Republicans argue they could weaken border enforcement. What this means is a real risk of a funding impasse ahead of the mid-February DHS deadline. DHS funding covers not just immigration, but also airport security, disaster response, and the Coast Guard. For Americans, the impact is practical. A partial funding lapse could disrupt Homeland Security services people rely on, especially travel and emergency response. Negotiations are expected to intensify over the next days, with leaders likely searching for narrower compromises to avoid a shutdown. The outcome will determine both DHS funding and how immigration enforcement rules evolve. Moving on to the next story, this one is about government infrastructure funding and a rail tunnel dispute. A reported deal involving a major rail tunnel and two famous transit hubs is sparking legal and political fallout because it ties infrastructure money to a personal naming request. The controversy centers on the Gateway Tunnel project between New York and New Jersey, one of the most important rail upgrades in the country. According to reporting published in the last 24 hours, the president privately offered to unfreeze about $16 billion in federal funding for the Gateway Hudson River Tunnel if Senate Democratic leadership supported renaming Washington Dulles Airport and New York Penn Station after him. The proposal was rejected. Soon after, New York and New Jersey filed a lawsuit seeking to restore the frozen funding, arguing the money had already been approved and halting it threatens construction. This happened in the middle of a funding dispute over the project, which is critical to rail travel in the Northeast Corridor. The tunnel is meant to replace aging infrastructure that carries hundreds of thousands of commuters. What this means is a fight over both money and precedent. Supporters of the lawsuit argue infrastructure funding should not be used as political leverage, while administration allies frame the dispute as part of broader funding negotiations. For Americans, the impact is practical. If funding stays frozen, construction could pause, risking jobs and disrupting a rail link that supports one of the country's busiest economic regions. A court is expected to consider emergency requests from the states in the coming days. The ruling will decide whether work continues while the political battle plays out, leaving a key infrastructure project caught in a legal standoff. Moving on to the next story, this one is about government security and threats against a lawmaker. A case tied to threats against a top lawmaker is renewing debate about political violence and accountability. It involves a man who had already been convicted for the January 6th Capitol attack and later received a presidential pardon. On February 5th, Christopher Moynihan pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor harassment charge after prosecutors said he sent text messages threatening House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries. Court filings say the messages called Jeffries a terrorist and said he must be eliminated. Language prosecutors argued created fear of real harm. The plea reduces earlier felony allegations, and sentencing is scheduled for April. The case grew out of messages sent last year after Moynihan had served about 2 years in prison for Jan 6 crimes and was pardoned in January 2025. Local prosecutors said the issue is not politics, but criminal threats, which they argue cross a legal line regardless of ideology. What this means is a reminder that threats against public officials are prosecuted at the local level even when they intersect with national politics. Supporters of aggressive enforcement say it protects democratic institutions, while critics continue to debate how pardons affect accountability. For Americans, the impact is about safety and rule of law. Cases like this shape how authorities deter violence and protect elected leaders. The next step is an April sentencing hearing that will determine probation and conditions. The episode highlights how the justice system is still dealing with the ripple effects of January 6th years later. Now, the next story comes from security and focuses on a U.S. military drug interdiction strike. The U.S. military says it carried out another lethal strike in its expanding fight against drug trafficking at sea, and the action is drawing attention because it uses battlefield force in a law enforcement mission. The incident happened in the Eastern Pacific on February 5th. U.S. Southern Command announced that American forces struck a vessel they believed was carrying narcotics along known trafficking routes. The military said 2 people on board were killed and no U.S. personnel were harmed. Within hours, news outlets published video released by the military showing a boat exploding or burning and placed the strike inside a broader campaign that began late last year targeting suspected drug vessels. This happened because the administration argues aggressive interdiction is needed to disrupt drug supply chains before narcotics reach North America. The strategy treats some trafficking routes as national security threats rather than standard policing cases. What this means is continued tension over how far military force should go in counter-drug operations. Supporters say it hits criminal networks early. Critics warn it raises legal and human rights questions, especially in international waters. For Americans, the impact ties directly to drug policy and security. These missions are meant to reduce the flow of narcotics that fuel addiction and crime at home, but they also shape how the U.S. is viewed by partners overseas. Officials are expected to release limited follow-up details, while legal challenges to the broader campaign continue. The strike shows the U.S. is doubling down on a high-risk strategy that blends military action with anti-drug enforcement. Moving on to the next story, this one is about government workforce rules and federal hiring power. The federal government just changed how thousands of civil servants can be hired and fired, and the decision could reshape how agencies operate. The move targets career officials whose jobs influence policy, not political appointees. On February 5th, the Office of Personnel Management finalized a rule creating a new employment category called Schedule, Policy, and Career. It allows agencies to reclassify certain policy-focused positions and removes long-standing civil service protections that normally make it difficult to dismiss career staff. OPM estimates the change could apply to about 50,000 employees, roughly 2% of the civilian federal workforce. The rule also shifts some whistleblower enforcement duties from an independent watchdog office to the agencies themselves. The administration says this is meant to give leaders more flexibility to manage staff who shape policy. Critics argue it weakens safeguards designed to keep government decisions insulated from political pressure. What this means is a legal and political fight is almost certain. Supporters see faster accountability. Opponents warn it could discourage experienced staff and reduce independent oversight. For Americans, the impact is indirect but real. Career civil servants run benefits programs, enforce safety rules, and manage public health and disaster responses. Changes in staffing stability can affect how smoothly those services operate. Unions and advocacy groups have already signaled lawsuits, and courts may decide whether implementation moves forward. The rule sets up a broader debate over how much independence the federal workforce should have from political leadership. And that's all for today's Mug Briefing. If this helped you start your morning a little clearer, mission accomplished.